Good morning, everyone. I'd first like to thank you for your patience and sorry for any confusion trying to access the webinar today. We have a presentation delivered by Dr. Neil Websdale from the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative. The presentation is called Reviewing the Murder of Susan Casey, the Process of Domestic Violence Fatality Review. This webinar will be recorded and distributed next week with closed captioning. If you're having technical issues, please use the chat pod on the lower right side or contact us at chaira@nau.edu. If you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A pod on the right side or use the chat pod. Thank you, and let's begin.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to be talking about a case that I reviewed back in 2013-2014 as part of my work in Montana as director of the National Death Review Initiative for US DOJ OVW. I do travel to communities, I do serve on review teams sometimes, and this was a case that I reviewed and was actively involved in. And I just want to be clear that I do have the permission of the family to share the information that I'm about to share with you. Some of this information came only from them during the course of the review. I've given this presentation a couple of times in public. It's always a little different because I learn new things as time goes by. But anyway, I wanted to let you know that nothing of what I'm going to share today contravenes the fatality review statutes or any legal or ethical strictures that we have in our work with OVW. So without further ado, I want to address the case of Susan Casey. Susie Casey was a 34-year-old woman when she disappeared in Montana. She lived in Glendive, Montana, and she disappeared in the early hours of the morning of April the 12th, 2008. She'd spent the night with a new boyfriend of hers, Brad Holzer, again, who I had a number of connections with in the course of the review. Actually sat with Brad and talked with him a couple of times one evening. So anyway, she disappears after spending the night with Brad. And on the morning of May the 6th, roughly 3 weeks later, her corpse was found, at first mistaken for a log floating in the Yellowstone River under the Fallon Bridge in eastern Montana. And eastern Montana, just so you know, the Yellowstone River flows from west to east out of the mountains down into the plains of eastern Montana. So immediately there was a thought that her body somehow had been dumped in the river. There were no signs of a vehicle left of Susie's. There were no signs of suicide or any previous suicide ideations in this case or attempts. So the investigation began apace from the moment she disappeared. There are a number of sensibilities regarding this case. If you want to look online, you can see some, quite frankly, rather sensationalistic coverage of this on the Aphrodite Jones show or on Dateline. And again, both those shows don't breach the statutes in terms of information, but their presentations tend to be a little sensational. We, as I say, have been very cognizant, as we always are in fatality review work, to be respectful of the confidentiality issues. And I actually spent some time with Susie's sister going through every slide in this presentation to make sure that she and her other family members were okay with this. So I'd like to start with a little bit of background information. I always think that when we review homicides and we do fatality review work, it's very important wherever we are, if we're doing in-depth review work. And to be clear about this case is at the extreme end of the detailed reviewing of cases. There were 6,000 pages of transcript in this case, including some of the interview transcripts we developed. We interviewed 35 people in connection with this case, and this was a very how can I say, intense review over a 2-day period in Glendive in a coffee shop in Montana in 2014. So anyway, by way of background, Susie's ancestors came from Norway. They were Norwegian stock. They came during the Progressive Era in United States history in 1911 with the homesteading acts in eastern Montana. Eastern Montana is flat, very cold, incredible extremes of temperature, a tough, tough place to live and make a living, a farming, ranching, rodeo community. In those days, Susie's parents told me that Susie and others were subject to a community culture that was very different than the culture that the parents and the grandparents and the ancestors grew up in. In the early days, in the Progressive Era, there was a town spirit, communication between people. Folks knew each other. It was a small town, but there was a skating rink, a theater. There were things for kids to do. There was a community spirit. There was a very much of folks knew each other well. But there was a very traditional sort of patriarchal culture as well in many ways. Single mothers were very much outcasts. There was a very strong religious influence in the community, which, for example, spelled a very strong anti-abortion culture, and you can see this in eastern Montana and some of those regions of the country. So for single battered women, there was a very long history of having some challenges in the community that were very deep-rooted. Women worked in those communities out of necessity. I interviewed both of Susie's sisters, and they told me that Susie was a tough young woman. She was a horse rider, a much-loved mother, and she would light up a room, according to the sisters. So it was very, how can I say, she was a very strong character, and later this strength would translate into her being very resistant physically as well. And Susie was feisty in her relationships, and it was clear that from time to time she too could have been an aggressor in her domestic violence. So this was the culture. This is how Susie was raised. She grew up too at a time when the Bakken oil patch in eastern Montana and particularly North Dakota was evolving. They were beginning to tap the oil reserves there, and this was in the wake of the 2008 recession. So this was a surging, booming area. So Glendive was a difficult place to live. The rents went up. Drug, alcohol consumption was endemic in the community, and the Bakken intensified these communities. Susie loved her booze as well, as did many people in the community. So it was a rough, tough place to be in those days. Susie had a number of significant intimate relationships, and I want to just spell these out. At the time she died, she was divorcing her second husband, Ted Casey, with whom she had 2 children, Charlie and Kiana. Her previous husband, her first husband, Marty Larson, had entered her life, and she had 2 children, Mariah and Shay, with Marty Larson. And her third significant intimate partnership was with Brad Holzer, who was her current boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. So we've got 3 men on the scene, and this would be significant because these men at the time of her disappearance became 3 suspects. When we look at the events leading up to Susie's murder, and I took these insights from the trial transcripts in this case, Brant Light was the Assistant Attorney General in Montana who prosecuted this case on circumstantial evidence. And as Brant says in the trial transcript, it was a beautiful night in Glendive on April the 11th. And Susie Casey was happy. And that was the overwhelming feeling, was that, at least on the surface, Susie was a happy person. But that day, Brad Holzer, her boyfriend, had received an anonymous email. The anonymous email says, "How's your girlfriend? How does your wife feel about it?" And this was a strange intrusion into Brad's life that he couldn't understand at the time. And again, he and I talked about this stuff over a beer, and it was clear to me that he was perplexed by this stuff, even although at the time he was a suspect of sorts for a while. Within an hour, Brad shot back on that email. "Not that it's any of your damn concern, but my girlfriend's fine. My wife hasn't given a shit about me since October of 2007. So Brad was still living with his wife, but that relationship was in the process of dissolving. So around noon, the unknown emailer responded that Brad Holzer was just like every other guy she's screwing, Susie's screwing, a spineless little prick, not man enough to tell her husband. So this antagonism was building between what looked like two guys who perhaps had a love interest, or some kind of interest at least, in Susie. The night of the 12th of April, Susie dropped her kids, her younger kids, Charlie and Kiana, off at Ted Casey's house. Now remember, Ted was her second husband, the one from whom she was divorcing, and she dropped them off so that she could go out. Around 8 p.m. she arrives at the home of her friend Linda Gay, where she had a few beers. And around 9 p.m. Ted, the second husband, received a call from a male voice telling him that Brad had been screwing his wife. And again, this language is taken from the police files that we had access to and various transcripts that we had access to for the reviews. This is, again, public record information. At that point, Ted called Susie to tell her that he knew that she was having an affair with Brad. And this was a revelation for Ted at the time. And again, I had tea with Ted, talked with Ted around the review stuff, and Ted shared with me this was a surprise to him. Around 11 p.m. that night, investigators note that Brad claimed he picked Susie up from the Ponderosa Apartments where Susie lived. And the Ponderosa Apartments then, maybe not now, but then certainly was sort of a ramshackle set of apartments in the center of Glendive, fairly close to City Hall. Susie lived upstairs in one of the apartments on the right as you move up the stairs. Susie and Brad drove to the river together. They drove about 10 miles down to a place called Intake, where they were close to the Yellowstone River, and spent the night there from roughly 11:30 probably until around 4. So the plot thickens. At around 1 a.m., Marty Larson, the first husband, who, as I mentioned, had re-entered Susie's life, Marty Larson called Susie. And it wasn't clear the nature of Marty's relationship with Susie at this time. It didn't come out until a little later. But Marty called Susie and left her a voicemail. "Please call me." This is a direct quote from the phone transcripts. "Please call me. I would love to hear from you and make sure everything is okay with you. I need to know. Thank you. Bye." We move on in time. 4:52 a.m. in the morning, the bank surveillance video records Brad's truck pulling up opposite Susie's apartment. So they'd left the intake area where they were hanging out, drinking some beers, getting to know each other, and they literally drove back into Glendive. So they're arriving back on the morning of April the 12th, and they park opposite Susie's apartment, diagonal parking slot, and they're there until 5:19. At 5:19, the bank surveillance video catches Susie leaving the truck. The dome light comes on, so the surveillance picks up a person leaving the truck that looked like Brad's truck. She exited. She was carrying a black leather coat, her purse, and her bra when she exited the truck. At that point, after she'd exited and she got roughly halfway across the road, Brad drove off. So I talked to Brad about this, and he said, yeah, if only I'd have stayed for a while. But he didn't. He drove off. She was halfway across the street. And here's the Ponderosa Apartments. You can see there's an alleyway to the left. There are cars here parked in front of them. Brad parked on the opposite side of the road to where those cars are parked that you can see there in that photograph. Apologies for the quality of the photograph. This is my own cell phone rendition. Again, you can see there the Chevrolet truck to the right is where Brad parked. And you can see there off to the left on the other side of the road, the US Bank, where there were surveillance cameras there that actually surveyed the street that could see folks moving. The levels of pixelation in 2008 weren't sufficient to make out specific faces, but nevertheless, they were there. They could make out images, broad images, including types of vehicles, although they couldn't read license plates at that time. Brad told investigators that he drove straight home. Now, the drive from Susie's place to Brad's is about 5 to 10 minutes, so it's not very far at all. Unusually, Brad told investigators that he parked in the garage. He usually just left his car on the front of his property, but that night he didn't. And he said, he told me as well, he told the investigators that he was worried that Ted Casey might damage it, because Ted had known just that night that he was having an affair, allegedly, with Susie. So because Ted had just got hold of this information, Brad was concerned. So he put his truck in the garage. So that was unusual. He went to bed. He and his wife apparently slept in separate rooms, but unusually, according to his wife, who was interviewed also by investigators, he closed the door to his bedroom. So there are two unusual parts to Brad's behavior that, again, temporarily at least, may have appeared suspicious to some people. Now, Marty had re-entered her life, and around 4:30 to 4:45, Marty would later tell investigators that he arrived in Glendive from Billings. And the drive from Billings to Glendive, heading east, out of eastern Montana towards the North Dakota border, is about 220 miles. And that ride on the freeway, on the interstate, basically follows the Yellowstone River. It tracks it. And Marty said that he arrived in Glendive from Billings. He drove to Susie's apartment because he couldn't get a hold of her, and he knocked softly on the apartment. He knew there were kids inside, so he knocked softly, said he didn't want to wake the kids up. Then he went back to his vehicle and parked around the corner to avoid detection, he said. He too would later claim that he was worried about Ted Casey. Round about 5:30 a.m. that morning, to complicate things even further, Ted drops Charlie and Kiana, kids, off at his brother's house, and he heads to City Hall, where he was working, polishing the floors. So Ted worked for the city, did a number of different jobs. He also had, and probably still has, a sort of a ranchish type property out at the edge of Glendive, and dropped the kids off. They know he dropped the kids off because he couldn't raise his brother, and he had to call his brother on his cell phone. So they have the cell phone record of him in the vicinity of his brother's house, calling him to let the kids in. So they've got the timing down. So around 5:30 to 5:45 a.m., the bank's surveillance video records a truck like Ted's passing Susie's apartment. So what it does is it puts Ted in the vicinity of the site of the disappearance of Susie Casey, roughly at the time it looked like she disappeared. And of course, Brad Holzer was in the vicinity as well. He was the one who dropped her off and ostensibly the last person to see her alive, other than her killer, whoever that might have been. At 5:45 a.m., Marty said he actually left Glendive to return to Billings, frustrated that he couldn't find Susie, even although he'd driven all that way to see her, and he was worried about her. At 5:30 a.m., Brad's estranged wife, Samantha, arrived home from her own boyfriend's house and looked in on Brad. She opened the door, she looked in, checked he was there. She would later tell investigators this. As I said, their marriage was moving in a different direction. They were apparently with other partners. At 10:45 a.m. that morning, according to the cell phone logs, Marty called Susie and left a voicemail for her. And again, I listened to this voicemail. The voicemail said, "Good morning, sweetie. I was just hoping that you would be willing to talk to me." So what we have, to recap, is three suspects: Marty Larson, Ted Casey, and Brad Holzer. So this was an unusual case, and eminently appealing, as you can imagine, for media outlets. So I have to say, too, that as I read these files, these voluminous files, and did these interviews, in the earlier stages, there were a couple of other potential suspects as well in this case, at least from where I was standing. So let's talk about her history with these three different men and just explore that a little bit, because again, when we do fatality review work, we obviously want to look at criminal histories, the biographies of offenders, to look at what they may or may not have done, biographies of suspects, etc. in this particular case. In the late 1980s, Marty was a convicted felon. He had an auto theft charge against him, and he served time in prison for that. So Marty was a felon, which meant that his access to weapons were restricted. His access to his children were also restricted. There were several incidents involving Marty, but there was one back in October of 1990 where he assaulted a woman with a baseball bat. There were felony charges, felony assault charges leveled against Marty in this case. Marty had engaged in threats and witness intimidation, it appears, in this case. And the case was dismissed without prejudice, which means that they could have returned to this case had there been further evidence or a greater willingness on the part of the witnesses to testify. So you may say that this information is hazy, but it's not that hazy. The woman who he assaulted with the baseball bat, I interviewed as part of this review. In fact, she worked in a hotel in Glendive at the time, and she was able to fully attest to what happened in this case. Marty and Susan were married in 1993 in Billings. By October of 1993, their first child, Mariah, was born in Billings. The family eventually moved from Billings, a big city. It's an oil and gas. It's the biggest city in Montana, in eastern Montana. It's the biggest city in Montana, period. A center of oil and gas production, and about 100,000 people now. They moved from Billings to Circle, a small town farming, ranching community where Susie had grown up. Susie was born in Wolf Point up on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, but the family grew up and had that tradition of living in Circle for a long time, as I said, since the Progressive era. Marty started work as a carpenter's helper at a construction company there, and in July of 1995, their second child, Shay, the son, was born. In October of 1995, Susie herself was charged with criminal mischief. We also know that during the period from 1993 until 1995, Marty was abusing Susie. She had reported this. She'd reported various forms of abuse in the relationship. which, when we look at it as domestic violence professionals, probably assumed the form of intimate terrorism as opposed to sort of seemingly less severe forms of violence, or what Michael Johnson refers to as situational couple violence. This kind of violence involved some hostage taking. It involved some pretty significant abuse, according to Susie and those close to Susie. It was clear in those early days of their relationship that Marty was a loner. He was very isolated, and in this he was no stranger. No, he was very much alike, similar to other domestic violence, serious domestic violence offenders. By February of 1996, because of the abuse and other developments, Susie and Marty formally separated. They went their separate ways, and in April of 1997, Susie filed for divorce. She was plagued by financial problems. She had to pay restitution on the criminal damage case that she had. She'd basically gotten drunk and driven a tractor trailer, damaged it, commandeered it and damaged it, and had to pay restitution. So that really tied her down in terms of her maneuverability, her resistive maneuverability. And she was a single mother with a couple of kids, working 2 jobs, with no social life, living at home. The divorce was finalized in February of 1998, and in August of 1998, Susie married Ted Casey. He was 14 years older than Susie at the time. In October of 1998, and you can see here the timing, I'll just flip back to the other slide, August of 1998, she married Ted. So she was moving on, but in Marty's mind, in many ways, she hadn't moved on, and Marty hadn't moved on. October the 6th, Marty was caught stalking Susie at her workplace and at her home. And we should say too that in all of these interviews that I did with many people, including other former partners of Marty Larson, they all said the same thing, that Marty was incredibly smart and conniving. So we should bear that in mind as we follow this case through. October the 11th, Marty made obsessive calls to Susie about seeing their children. He wanted to see the kids. And on one occasion, he drove from Billings to Glendive. You can see the distance there. And came to the residence, Ted Casey's residence, used gloves to steal stuff from the Casey vehicle outside the residence. October the 15th, Marty made a return trip to the Casey residence again, this time with a 12-gauge shotgun. He pled guilty around that time to criminal trespass, theft, criminal mischief, and stalking. He admitted to wearing gloves, admitted to changing his shoes to avoid discovery. On November the 2nd of 1998, there was a permanent order of protection granted to Susie against Marty. And this was a big deal in those days, and it was one of the last permanent orders of protection issued in the state of Montana. So the order of protection would run indefinitely. So that was the history with Marty up to the point, and clearly he came back into her life at her initiation, not Marty's. And that was around 2007, but we'll return to that issue. So I want to say a few words now about Susie's history with Ted Casey. In 1997, Susie and Ted began dating. And in August of 1998, they married, as I already noted. On October the 20th, 2007, so this went 10 years, Ted was arrested for domestic violence. In Montana, it's known as PFMA, partner and family member assault. He was arrested for slapping Susie. I quizzed him closely about this. He talked openly with me about this, and he said that he had slapped Susie. They'd been out drinking downtown one night, downtown Glendive. He said that Susie had been drunk and had been flirting with other men. He wanted to get her out of there, and he took her out, and on the street he slapped her at one point. The police were called, and Ted was arrested for that. Ted also told me that on a number of occasions that Susie had slapped him, independent of him slapping her or being aggressive with her. And that was Ted's account of the violence in their relationship. I talked with a number of people about this, including Susie's mother, who told me that she thought that Ted's violence was more serious than Ted was letting on. So, again, we see competing accounts, and this is typical in death review cases. We see competing interpretations of what's happened, and of course the idea of good death review is to try as far as possible to produce evidence and insights and interpretations that gel with the evidence and comport with the evidence. So we reconcile these various differences if that's possible. And we recognize too that there are, in the final analysis, there may be competing interpretations of this, and we respectfully agree to differ. So there was a lot of that in this particular case. In November of 2007, Susie moved out from her home with Ted, and she took the 4 children with her. Ted was also raising Mariah and Chad as well. So this was a major change for Susie. She was now a single mother, facing impoverishment, living in the Ponderosa apartments on her own for the first time in a long time, raising 4 children, and obviously leaving the relationship with Ted and facing a divorce. So these were very difficult times, and this was also a time when she was beginning to engage in domestic violence program services. On March 21st, 2008, Susie reports Ted's domestic violence, jealousy, and stalking. Susie was fearful of losing her vehicle in the divorce. There were arguments about money. Susie eventually files for divorce. Ted admitted to being upset about Brad. He said that he acknowledged that they'd been arguing about money, but he also said that Susie, in her own way, was very secretive. And he said that he gave a couple of examples of this, he said that when they began dating, she was married to Marty Larson, but she didn't let on to Ted that she was married to Marty. And he also said that she was also on 5 years probation for criminal mischief, the offense that I referenced earlier, she was paying restitution for, that she also did not communicate to Ted. Ted said he found that out by talking with one of the court folks in the local community who asked him, clearly in a manner that contravened the privacy rules, whether or not Susie had paid off her restitution debts or not. This was around the time that they had just got married, and clearly this was a surprise to Ted. He said he realized then that she was very secretive. And I just want to make a general point here, and again, we see this a lot in death reviews. Not only do we see victims being sparing with the information that they share, which is understandable given the many, many things that they face and the challenges and difficulties they face. So the secrecy that we see with perpetrators commonly, the minimization, the rationalization, the justifications, the outright lies, we also see that sometimes with victims. So sometimes that flies in the face of our better judgment in terms of how we see or would like to see victims. For example, it may not comport very well with the social worker ethos to involve themselves in domestic violence cases where they work from a strengths perspective. I understand they work from that, but those other sides of these cases for some battered women can be very challenging sometimes and difficult. So what was Susie's history with Brad Holzer? Brad had actually known Susie for a long time. They'd been classmates, they dated in high school. So in some ways, although Brad was a new boyfriend, this wasn't the first time that they dated. On March 15th, Brad and Susie met at a St. Patrick's Day festival in Glendive, Montana. And I should say too that, Brad liked a beer, as did Susie, but Brad also had a very good job. He worked in the Bakken oil fields. He was a supervisor over there. He traveled to North Dakota, sort of a week or 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, that kind of thing. But anyway, they bumped into each other at this St. Patrick's Day festival. Their relationship blossomed very quickly, although Brad had never met Susie's 4 children. So from March 15th until the time Susie disappeared, the night of April the 11th, Susie had not introduced Brad to the new kids. But it was clear that Susie was very happy with this new relationship with Brad, or at least that's how it looked on the surface. That's how she reported that to others. Brad and Susie talked daily by phone. They saw each other frequently. They were in very frequent contact. So let's turn now and look at this investigation through the lens of what we learned in Fatality Review and through the lens of what I am able to share on the public record. In May of 2007, Marty told investigators that Susie had contacted him, offering him photos of their children. The children had grown. She hadn't any contact with Marty for probably 9 years or so. He hadn't been in her life, to everybody's knowledge, I think. So she had been cautioned about approaching Marty because of her previous experiences with Marty, but regardless of what folks advised, Susie contacted Marty. And Mariah and Shay, the 2 kids, confirmed this, that the older kids, their shared children, that Susie had been the one to do the outreach. On June 27th, Ted learned for the first time that Susie and Marty were seeing each other, probably had rekindled the flame in terms of a romantic relationship. September of 2007, there's evidence of photos of Mariah and Shay on Marty's phone that investigators obtained. Marty purchased a minivan and said that he planned to move with Susie and the 4 children to Rapid City, South Dakota, with a view to Marty taking up a new job. Marty was a technician. He serviced drinks machines, and he had some business in Glendive from time to time. He worked the sort of Eastern Montana circuit, but supposedly Marty was due to move with Susie to Rapid City, South Dakota. And you'll notice here the timing. And again, with this particular Fatality Review, the timeline was very dense and very complicated. And again, as we do Fatality Review, we learn how to do these very detailed timelines. But one of the things that stands out when you look at the timeline, the case from a distance, is the timing of the purchase of the minivan. And that purchase happened just after the new year, after Susie had left Ted Casey, was moving towards divorcing Ted, but at the same time as she was threatened with the loss of her vehicle because of the divorce and because she had to, get her 4 kids around, because she was living then in the Ponderosa apartments. So the timing of the purchase and the offer of the new life in Rapid City to a woman who had been subject to domestic violence with her second husband, that coalescence of factual information ought not be lost. However, we also see at the same time, so from roughly June of 2007 until February, March of 2008, Susie and Marty have rekindled the romantic flame, it seems. And there was clear evidence of Susie staying over with Marty on maybe one occasion at least, Marty staying over with Susie. So I think it's safe to say that they had engaged in a romantic relationship during that period. But in the middle of March, Susie meets Brad and begins to exit the relationship with Marty. And remember, Marty in February of 2008 had bought the van. He was making plans. He was projecting that he was going to scoop Susie out of Glendive, move to Rapid City, and again repossess his family and Susie, it seems. And this is just a map to show you. You can see here, if you look, you see the main concentration of population around Billings, and then as you move east or northeast, you move through alongside the Yellowstone River to Miles City, a beautiful old place, Miles City, lovely old settlement. You see the town of Terry there, a very small town of Terry, and then up to a place called Fallon, which you see just further on from Terry, and then on to Glendive. And then that freeway heads on up eventually to the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri rivers at the North Dakota-Montana border, just north of Sidney, Montana. So this is the terrain. It's flat, it's wet and rainy that time of the year. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Please notice the town of Terry, which has just a few hundred people. And please notice the town of Fallon. Again, the Fallon Bridge is there, very small. It's not even a town, it's just a little settlement. These were all named after the colonizing soldiers from the army that came through when the US Army took this area from native peoples back in the 1860s and 1870s. So a lot of rivers through here, tributaries from the Yellowstone. And again, the Yellowstone is flowing from west to east, and that's important. Investigators suspected that Susie's body was dropped off the Terry Bridge and drifted down to Fallon, where they eventually located it. That's the theory. So that's one of the reasons why I'm using the map here to illustrate this stuff. So the investigation continues. Turns out that on April the 10th, 2008, just 2 days before the official disappearance, 2 days, Marty visited Susie and the kids in Glendive. They went out for a bite to eat for lunch or something. Marty later admitted to sending the emails and making calls to Ted. Marty may have also enlisted the support of a former girlfriend to call Brad's wife, because Brad's wife, Samantha, also received a call from a female informing her of Brad's infidelity with Susie. So there was a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, a lot of nastiness in this case, a lot of tip-offs, a lot of problematic leads to deal with. So you can see here how potentially law enforcement, that did a fabulous job in this case, by the way, were torn in a number of different directions. This was a very complicated case. So the investigation proceeds, and court documents show, and this is the trial transcript where I'm getting my information from, and again, so it's on the public record, you can purchase this. On April the 12th, 2008, the documents show 29 calls made to Susie Casey's phone from Marty's phone between 12:48 and 5:45 a.m. So they've triangulated the cell phone tower data. Marty first utilized a Verizon Glendive tower to call Susie at 4:22 a.m. So in other words, he leaves Billings and he arrives in the vicinity of that Glendive tower at 4:22. You can see how the timing here is critical. Marty last utilized the same Glendive tower at 5:45 a.m. So that's the window, the time frame that he's in Glendive from his home in Billings. Now you remember Ted Casey is also in the vicinity, and as we know, Brad Holzer is also in the vicinity. So the investigation at this point is complicated. At 4:26 a.m., a silver minivan, the same make, model, and color as Marty's, travels east on Bell Street. And we don't need to know the detailed geography here. I'll give you a little picture, but basically it's traveling east. Can't make out the license plate, but nevertheless. A minute later, a person, maybe Marty, question mark, walks east on Bell Street in front of the US Bank that I pointed out earlier towards Susie's apartment. We don't know who that person is, and again, this raises interesting questions about security systems, about levels of pixelation, making out facial appearance, facial gesture, etc. But as technology improves, our surveillance improves in some of these cases. And these surveillance techniques may be significant for victims of violence in courtroom settings, for example, where they're subject to courtroom intimidation, for example. So at 5:19 a.m., Susie walks to her apartment. So remember, she gets out of the car, Brad's car. She literally walks across the street to her apartment, to the door that is always open, to the Ponderosa apartments, and she's going to go up the stairs. So question mark here. One possibility is that sometime around 5:20 or 5:30 a.m., Marty Larson kills Susie, Casey, somewhere in the vicinity of that entryway. At 5:38 a.m., an individual is seen carrying items walking west on Bell Street in front of the US Bank, back to presumably a parked car. Again, question mark, is that person Marty? In other words, has he killed Susie? Maybe in the alleyway, in that time, walked back to the bank to get in his vehicle. He's carrying her possessions, and then he pulls around the back of the bank building, down the alleyway, up the other side to where he had killed Susie, loads her into the vehicle. So this is the alleyway again. It's the Ponderosa building, entryway. Police found footprints in the entryway that were consistent with the shoes of Marty Larson. But that kind of evidence is not confirmatory that it was Marty there, it's just consistent with. So it includes, but it doesn't pinpoint. So you can see here in the alleyway there are some dumpsters here to the left. Lee Johnson, who headed up the investigation, a fabulous investigator in the state of Montana, heads up the Criminal Investigation Division. Lee took the fatality review team down that alley and into the apartment area to show reviewers the vicinity. And again, this is a good illustration of how to do death review to familiarize folks with the area, what's happening, etc., etc. So the theory is potentially, one theory is that Marty killed her in the alleyway, left her there, walked from those dumpsters, as you're looking at the PowerPoint slide, walked from left to right, down towards the US Bank, and then parked his vehicle somewhere at the back there to conceal it, and then drove it around. Then he came up the back of the building, drove up the driveway, and loaded her in. That's one possibility. There's just the map that you can see of Bell Street. I won't belabor this, but you have access to the PowerPoint. You can see this and work it out for yourself if you're interested or you want to watch the videos. So at 5:39 a.m., the minivan passes the bank towards the Ponderosa apartments. Does he load her body in there? Does he load it from the front? Did he pull in? Did he drive around the back? Did he drive around the front? We've got video of a van driving towards the Ponderosa apartments past the bank. Again, you can't work out necessarily which van it is, but the circumstantial evidence is something that the state would go back to later. So Marty loads her, leaves Glendive, maybe they head back to Billings. Big question mark. A chilling phone call at 5:45 a.m. from Marty to Susie's phone. And again, I've listened to this phone call. Hello, just hoping to hear you are okay. Now, if Marty Larson did kill Susie, then he probably killed her between 5:20 and 5:30 a.m., probably. But he left that message at 5:45 a.m. That gives you a sense of what we might be dealing with here. At 5:47 a.m., a silver minivan like Marty's is seen heading west on Bell Street. And that minivan is heading out of town. And remember, the last cell phone tower hit. Investigators suspect that Marty dumped Susie's body, in the Yellowstone from the Terry Street Bridge that I noted on the map earlier. It's 38 miles from Glendive to Terry. 38 miles. It's a 30-minute drive at the speed limit. Your estimated time of arrival from the time that the silver minivan was seen leaving was 6:17 a.m. The estimated sunrise, that time of day, that date of that year, was 6:21. So the timing here was either very, very well planned or fortuitous if Marty killed Susie. I talked with Susie's mother about this. Susie's mother said that she thought Marty planned to kill Susie before Marty left Billings. In other words, it was planned. He knew that she was seeing a new man. He knew that he was being jettisoned from the relationship by another man, and he left. He had that plan in his head. Others have argued that because he was there in the entryway, shuffling his feet, waiting for Susie, he saw her making out with Brad in the truck for 20 minutes or so, and that was what enraged him, and that was what led to him killing her. Again, two alternative theories here. That, I drove out to the Terry Street Bridge to track this as part of the death review activity, and that was the bridge. And you can see it's a pretty bleak place. And then 10 miles down, you've got the Fallon Bridge where the body was found. At 10 a.m., roughly 10 a.m., Marty arrived back in Billings. He showered, he took his car to the car wash. However, significantly, Marty's dark-colored shoes, orange-reddish baseball hat, and his non-hooded sweatshirt have never been found. Neither of Susie's black leather coat, her bra, purse, and other personal items. And these items were very significant in the case in the construction of the building of the circumstantial evidence, which was really a brilliant build in many ways by the state. And I'll explore this, revisit this in just a moment. But Marty enters the Blue Basket, a gas station in Lockwood, just east of Billings, at 1:39. And we've got the footage from that. You can see, and these were from the exhibits in the court. Note his orange-reddish baseball hat and his sweatshirt. Video surveillance shows Larson arriving at 7:15, leaving at 7:22. Showed him entering wearing sunglasses, dark-colored shoes, lighter-colored logo on the back, jeans, white t-shirt. Larson entered the town pump in Miles City via a side door rather than the front door. So the state puts this circumstantial evidence together. In other words, Marty, they alleged, killed Susie. She resisted, as one would, and fought, and he had some injuries on him when they eventually got to him to interview him. But the clothing was a big issue because they got him leaving Billings with one set of clothes on and coming back from Billings with a different set of clothes on. So, hence, the circumstantial evidence. It wasn't until February of 2012, however, almost 4 years later, that Marty was arrested in Phoenix on a Montana warrant charging him with Susie's murder. On April the 1st of 2013, he was found guilty of strangling Susie and dumping her body in the Yellowstone River. On July the 30th of 2013, he was sentenced to 100 years for deliberate homicide and 10 years for evidence tampering. There was an appeal in this case. Marty's lawyers filed an appeal claiming various things that we don't really need to dwell on, but that their police interrogation had violated his right to counsel, violated his right to remain silent, and that the original defense counsel provided was ineffective by failing to present the district court in Montana with the video recording of Mr. Larson's full invocation of his rights. So this is legalese for the appeal. The appeal effectively was denied. So Marty is still incarcerated in the Montana Penitentiary. He's done one interview, and he's done it with Dateline. I approached him to do an interview, but he wouldn't speak with me, claiming that he didn't want the state's case rehashed. I said I wasn't interested in rehashing the state's case. I was interested in talking about his life, but he didn't want to talk, and I understand too. So what does this tell us a little bit? What are the lessons from this case about fatality review? And I use this case to illustrate some of the central themes of fatality review work, because it was such a lightning rod of a case. It was so intense. A lot of discussion, a lot of difference of opinion, a number of people giving testimony in different directions, which has really all kinds of implications for the work that we do. So I want to just focus on a few things here. First of all, the philosophy of the work that we do. The philosophy of the work that we do is we don't want to blame and shame people. I use these silly examples, but this is a radioactive wolf from Chernobyl. The reason the Soviets had the Chernobyl explosion, which devastated the community, and many thousands of deaths have been traced to this, not the immediate explosion, but the radioactive contamination that contributed to goodness knows how many deaths and birth defects in the ensuing years. But the Soviets knew about problems in their nuclear power plants for 20 years at least. They had a number of accidents and they hushed them up. They didn't want to discuss things. So we don't want review activity that necessarily hushes things up. We want review activity that comports with the rule of law and due process, but we want access to as much information as we can get, because we can learn from the information. So we guardedly use the nuclear power review process because it's not necessarily been that effective historically. It's better now than it was. Oh, I'm sorry, I should warn you too. This next slide I'm about to show you may offend some people. We do this work. I can't imagine that that's the case very often, but close your eyes for the next one. I'll tell you when you're through it. These are medical error deaths in the United States. There are 250,000 medical error deaths in the United States each year. These are preventable medical errors. The medical profession is not well known for reviewing its tragic outcomes, its preventable errors, very thoroughly or very well. There's a major concern with litigation. Hence, the death rate is quite high. It's more complicated than that, but I'm making a simple connection here. When we compare this with the aviation industry, we look at Sully's landing on the Hudson, Captain Sullenberger's landing, and when he did this in, I think it was 2009, he saved the lives of everyone on that plane. His plane had gone up, it engaged in its ascent, and a flock of geese, I think, or something, flew into one of the engines, disabled it, and the plane was going down. He landed with his team that plane on the Hudson River in New York, full of folks. I mean, that was a disaster waiting to happen. And when he was quizzed about this later, they said to him, wow, that was so heroic that you did that. Clint Eastwood made a movie about this. It was so heroic. How did you manage to keep your cool in that situation? It must have been so incredibly stressful. You only had literally seconds to make your decisions. And Sullenberger told the audience when he was confronted with this that, the hell with that. I mean, this was about planning. This was about communication, collaboration, and coordination that was intuitive. The stakes were very, very, very high. And we've learned in aviation over the last 40 years, through our death reviews, through our transparent death reviews and our very challenging death reviews, where we bring a lot of different players to the table, we've learned how to do this in a detailed, meticulous way, so that we were on automatic pilot, literally, and I use that word guardedly. We were on automatic pilot almost in terms of landing that plane, because we knew. We knew historically that the problems planes went down in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s was because of the domineering attitude of captains that wouldn't listen to people, that wouldn't pay attention to the viewpoints of other people on planes or other professionals like mechanics, people who served drinks, who could see the wing of the plane from a different angle, who heard things that the captain couldn't necessarily hear, and junior pilots who had input that wasn't valued. They learned from those errors to bring together, and as Sullenberger said, and he was widely quoted on this, you take a team of individual experts and you turn them into an expert team. And that's what happened with the Susie Casey review. We took a disparate group of folks from all kinds of professions and we brought them together to review this case. And that, in some ways, is the essence, par excellence, of good fatality review that follows the NTSB model, because the stakes are high. And we did that, I think, in the Casey case, just as the state proceeded to do this very well with the prosecution, Broughton Light's prosecution in this case, based almost exclusively on circumstantial evidence that was rendered very compelling. So how do we do this? What other ways did the Casey case exemplify good fatality review? Well, it exemplified it in a number of ways. We always encourage groups to build detailed timelines. Now, it just so happens that the Montana review team, both the Montana State review team and the Indian Country review team, has a paid facilitator to help build timelines with the team. So timeline construction is a very important aspect of the case review. And the Montana team, unlike many other teams in the country, but the Montana team reviews cases for 2 days at a time. They literally sequester the team away for 2 days. They do a lot of preparatory work. In the Casey case, we interviewed 35 people to contribute to the information in the death review. So I personally, in that case, interviewed 9 people, mostly Susie's family members in that case, to contribute to the review process. So this was an incredibly detailed review, and the timeline was very extensive and complicated. But the idea of the timeline in the Casey case was to see how the case rolled out. And the reason for this is obvious. I mean, I know you know this probably better than I do, but these cases are crimes of what I call accumulation. They build over time. And capturing that is important. This is not like a burglary or a robbery. It's not a one-off on the street. It's not even like a domestic violence case where, you know, maybe the couple engages in slapping each other once on a Friday night here every 6 months. This was a different order of case. So we needed the timeline, the detailed timeline, to unpick the case. Now, there are other teams that spend multiple months, sometimes a year, reviewing a case, only they do it in a different way. They may meet for, I don't know, every month for 3 hours or something. I mean, the variations on this are profound, but the message is that detailed, wide-angle lens death review is the way to go. And this was an example of that work. And those of you I know that are on the call who are doing this work, you know, if you're doing wide-angle death review lens, you know, death review, you know how valuable that can be in terms of pointing out gaps in systems, failures to communicate, to coordinate, to collaborate, etc. Another thing that the Montana team does, which other teams sometimes do, for example, the groups in Massachusetts do this, they'll travel to the community. The Massachusetts folks review cases for a full day, not 2 days, but they travel to the community as well, like the Montana people do. And the Massachusetts people have been doing that since 2015. But in traveling to the community, you render the review more permeable to the community to the extent possible given the fatality review confidentiality statutes. And in the second day, locals are brought into the review process in Montana. So we have that incredibly interesting, detailed, sometimes threatening input from the community. So another word another lesson to come out of the review team in Montana is that the team has eclectic membership, wide-ranging membership. We want people on review teams who see domestic violence and who see cases from a different angle. The reality is that there's a lot of dogma in the domestic violence movement about what causes this stuff. And there are a lot of differences of opinion, and we need to capture those differences of opinion. So no one has the keys to the kingdom on this stuff. All of this stuff is what sociologists refer to as socially situated. There are some common themes in many of these cases, and we know what they are. But there are a lot of different ways to interpret. So we want to bring skilled people, and we want to create, as Sullenberger said, a motley assortment of people who are experts and turn them into an expert team. This is a Lowry painting from England that captures that eclecticism. Confidentiality. Just a few words about this. Confidentiality in this case was very, very tricky to deal with because we had access to large numbers of respondents, interviewees in the field. So treading this path was challenging. But again, this case illustrates the need to be respectful of the confidentiality statutes, but also of the privacy and the ethical issues involved in sharing information about those dead, those gone, or even those incarcerated. So there were things that came up in the review, for example, about the parties in this case that are potentially damaging or humiliating that we would never discuss in public or in a public forum or a public report of this case. But we need to know what they are. The team would have access to those things. So that the idea is to shield the deliberation of the team, not to cover up or render difficult to access the issues that might help us with better communication, coordination, collaboration, and prevention. So these confidentiality guarantees differ across state, they differ across nations, and there's no generic word here, but if you go to our website, you'll see some guidance on this from Alicia Aiken and a number of other people. There are differences, obviously, between public, private, and confidential information. Attorneys can be very helpful here on your team. And as we said, with an eclectic array, you want defense counsel on teams wherever you can get it, as well as prosecutors, for example. So we want a range of attorneys on teams, just as sometimes, if it's permissible, we have judges on teams as well. I want to say a few words now about risk assessment, because the risk assessment literature is in its infancy. I think it's fair to say. We've done a good job through the pioneering work of people like Jackie Campbell, Jill Messing, and others, looking at some of the things that appear to cluster in cases before death. But this is a really early literature. One of the things that the pioneering research did was to ask proxy informants in cases where women have died. And basically the classic research in this area compared a group of women's cases where women had been killed, the femicide group, with a control group. And Campbell's original study, published in 2003 in the American Journal of Public Health, compared 220 death cases with 343 control cases where women had experienced domestic violence in the preceding 2 years but had not died. So with the death cases, they interviewed proxy informants, and they interviewed, I think, one proxy informant drawing from medical examiner or coroner information and police files. One of the lessons of fatality review, and particularly the Casey case, is that when you interview proxy informants, it's very much hit and miss. It depends on who you ask. When I interviewed 9 family members, or those who knew Susie closely, 8 of those 9 told me that Susie had shared with them that she did not think that Marty Larson was capable of killing her. 8 out of 9 of them. Only her mother shared that Susie thought that Marty was capable of killing her. And this is a caution when we do proxy informant research, when we're building risk assessment profiles. We cannot necessarily rely on proxy informants. And we have to be careful, if we can, to interview more than one, if we can do this. Our predictive abilities to predict homicide, intimate partner homicide, are very, very low. In fact, it's fair to say that we cannot predict. And there are a lot of dogmatic statements made in the research literature, but certainly in the practitioner literature. The Lethality Assessment Project of the Maryland Network has been guilty of this. We can predict, therefore we can prevent. This is, for anyone who knows their statistical stuff, this is patently nonsense. We cannot do that. We are better at predicting things that happen more frequently, such as assault in the first place in a domestic violence situation, or an intimate relationship, or even reassault, or maybe even severe reassault. But predicting a very, very rare event like intimate partner homicide out of the vast population of domestic violence offenses in general, or IPV cases in general, is impossible. So we have to be very cautious, and this review in particular was very instructive in that regard. There are certain things that we need to know that come out of a detailed case review like this, and indeed nationally out of detailed case reviews. And one of the things we're doing in Flagstaff in the summer is we're bringing reps from 20 teams to a uniform reporting summit that we have. We're building a clearinghouse where we hope that within the next few years we'll be able to develop a common core centralized data repository where teams can report to us in a confidential manner, in a secure manner, so that we can begin to gather information nationally about cases and begin to get a sort of a 30,000-foot view of what's happening out there in terms of intimate partner homicide. But there are certain things we need to know about fatality review work that we don't know. We need to know much more about the implementation of recommendations and the impact of this work on law and law-like systems. We need to know how teams have expanded into communities, into government, for example, and how teams inform political activity potentially through their representatives or through folks who are legally entitled to lobby. So the Montana team's a classic example. When I went out there to train that group back in 2000, 2002, somewhere in there, there were 7 people at the table. That team now has 18 official members, probably another 10 ex officio members, and when they bring in the community, those reviews can involve 40, 45, 50 people. So you can see team expansion is a phenomenon that's been occurring all over the country. And again, this case was a good example of that. We had very intense representation. We need to know how teamwork expands public education and awareness campaigns. There have been major changes in these areas. How have teams contributed to that? We need to know about shifts in what I call the 3 C's: communication, collaboration, coordination. We need to know about changes in rates of IPV and IPH, DV-related crimes in general. And we need to be very careful with this. And this is one of the reasons we're building the uniform reporting system, is that people celebrate the fact, and they should, that there's been a decline in intimate partner homicides. But it's very, very premature to suggest that those homicides have decreased, and there's been basically a 1 percentage point decrease per year for the last 30 years, just on average. But it's really premature to suggest that that's because of our multi-agency or interdisciplinary initiatives, like, for example, even fatality review. We can't conclude that. In fact, it's very likely that those declines may be connected with the delivery of more effective medical services. And I addressed this in some of the other webinars that I've done over the years. The trend on the curve is the same in, say, Canada. But when we really begin to look at this stuff carefully, the medical interventions with things like gunshot wounds and knifings, serious injuries that would bleed to death, Those medical interventions, on-scene delivery, better communications, antisepsis, learning how to pump people with fluids, the rise of trauma centers, all these things probably have lowered the homicide rate by 2.5 to 4.5 percentage points a year, which far outweighs the impact of the natural decline in that curve. So the fatality review work and the national repository work on deaths raises interesting questions, and we need to get there. We need to look at the way teams are using their fatality review fundings to their funding allocations to change resource bases, to get new grants, foundation dollars, etc. And we need to know links with other multi-agency and interdisciplinary work. The Casey case, but the review cases in general raise some very important questions for us in terms of the work that we do. And these become very challenging for us. So, you know, a classic question in the field of domestic violence, which I always felt was an interesting question to ask, was the question, you know, why doesn't she leave? It's an interesting question, you know. Now, of course, the question begs the comment that, well, obviously she's compromised, she's this, she's that. Some people think it's, you know, trauma bonding or whatever it is. But some people think, well, that's an inappropriate question to ask victims because, you know, they've made the decision to stay, so they may feel it's safer to stay. So there are all these machinations, but I think another interesting question that arises out of death review is, why doesn't he leave? Why does he cling and pine in the way that he does? And in the Larson case, and as I say, Larson was convicted of this, very concretely convicted of this. The evidence was quite compelling. Why did Larson pursue her? Why was Larson the jolted lover? Why was Larson so enraged by all these things? We have to ask ourselves that question. Why didn't he give her up? And I think that gives us a clue as to the psychology of many dangerous batterers. And if we just assume that someone like Larson, who's clearly physically stronger than Susie, who's very smart in many ways, who clearly, if he did kill her, and I think he did, and we go along with the jury's decision in this that he killed her, if he did, that was apparently very, very well planned to the minute. How is it that he felt that way about her? Is he just a cold-blooded sociopath? Or is he a more vulnerable, dependent batterer who is deeply incensed by his powerlessness and his lack of control over Susie temporarily, and he kills her as a final act of retribution out of his, what I call, humiliated fury? Why does he do this? How does he do this? It was a very personal way of killing her. He strangled her. He broke her hyoid bone. It was very personal, up close kind of killing. So why didn't he leave? Why didn't he just exit? He clearly was an emotionally isolated offender, and this is a very common theme. The notion of control in our work, it's very common to use the language of coercive control these days, and I understand the reason. I mean, this has a long history in the domestic violence movement, but the notion of control, to me, is problematic sometimes if we take it to mean that control is entirely realized. Susie fought to the end and maneuvered to the end in her relationship with Marty. According to Susie's mother, Susie was terrified of Marty towards the end. She was terrified. And yet she still maneuvered, resisted. The notion of control is something that, as long as it doesn't imply absolute control, in other words, we're willing to recognize the agency of battered women up until the end, that may still be, you know, talking about his attempts to control may be helpful. But the realization of control, some of these cases raise questions about the full realization of control. And I have to say that I personally prefer the language of intimate terrorism. I think it's more useful than the language of coercive control. Clearly, the research on humiliation and shame and the links to rage and anger are very, very important for death reviewers to look at. This particular killing evidenced enormous rage and shame. It takes a lot to break the hyoid bone. It's one thing to strangle someone, it's another thing to snap the hyoid bone. And when they did the autopsy on Susie, her bone was snapped. The shame of losing the love interest for the batterer can be deeply humiliating. Marty had projected his future hopes and dreams on Susie, moving to Rapid City with her. He was deeply enraged. I suggest the mechanism here for understanding this is not just that Marty's power and control were ebbing, which they were, but that this was emblematic of his humiliated fury. So where this leaves us is also that understanding the act of homicide, and these are after all death reviews, leaves us with the ironic place that, anger in some ways, especially in terms of the immediacy of the act, is central. And unregulated anger is central to understanding the act itself of killing. This doesn't mean to say that anger management is the intervention mode of choice to deal with battering. Clearly it isn't. Clearly we need to have folks looking at other things as well. But to deny the importance and the centrality of anger does not comport with our death review work, neither in this case nor in many other cases either. The Larson case also raises questions of intent. If we're to believe Susie's mother, it looks like Marty had planned this out to the minute, in great detail. To others, they were less sure of this. But the notion of intent in general raises very important questions for us. We use the language of intent, or we presume intent very quickly, and this is obviously a requirement in the criminal law in some ways, but the language of intent or the language of strategies or tactics is something that we assume sometimes, and we're very quick to assume that batterers have that, or that killers have that. And what emerges from fatality review, and what emerges in this case, is something that raises questions that are important. And no one's saying that offenders don't have strategies or intent or plan things out or have tactics. They often do. But we can't always assume they do, and the fatality review wisdom is really that we need to speak through the evidence, and if we're going to argue for strategy, we need to talk about what that is and what attests to that strategy or those tactics. So we cannot necessarily start by believing what people tell us they think is the intent on the part of someone else. We also know that what batterers report to us after they've killed may be compromised by the rationalizations, the justifications that we talked about earlier, but they may also be compromised by the fact that the act of killing itself can compromise the memory and may in fact itself be traumatizing. So this is paradoxical, it's difficult to deal with, but when we interview offenders, we need to bear that in mind. Sometimes offenders themselves have dissociative amnesia. Sometimes they're bullshitting. Sometimes they're just plain lying. Who knows? But again, the Larson case raised some of these questions. But some of the things that this case clearly tells us is that these old notions that we have of battered woman syndrome or cycles of violence, these stock scripts that we have about battered women and perpetrators, these are very dangerous scripts to have, these black and white ways of seeing the world. When we do death review, we see resistive maneuverability that doesn't necessarily comport with the sort of the passive image of battered women as helpless, hapless, agencyless individuals. It appears that things are more complicated than that. And what we take from the death review work, and we took this from Susie's case, is that Susie was navigating a maze of systems. And when we did the outcomes of the case and the recommendations, which I'm not going to focus on today, it's clear that Susie saw a confusing maze of paperwork, of agencies, of many stops in the shopping, so to speak, to deal with the system. And this speaks to the complexity of the system, but it also speaks to the way we have a disconnect between how we see systems and how victims see systems. So the case review gets at some of those issues. So one of the things, and I know I'm being reminded here that my time's running out, so I have to close, but one of the things here is that traditional advocacy perspectives and other appreciations from law enforcement say may downplay battered women's complexity. Understanding their agency helps us understand abuser behavior and helps us understand safety planning. But one of the bottom lines that we have in this case, the Casey case, and this is not to blame Susie for her own demise, clearly we know who's responsible, but safety planning ought always take into account that victims can never really know what perpetrators are capable of doing. Perpetrators, like victims, lead secret lives, like us all sometimes, have confidential private aspects of our lives they don't want celebrated. So those are some of the lessons. So I need to pause now and take some questions if indeed we have them. One of the questions I've got up on the screen concerns advocates and victims being reluctant to share their story, how difficult it is with the danger assessment. The danger assessment tool, however, some prosecutors find very useful. So I think the question is, if I can discern what the question is through the lingo here up on my screen, it's that the danger assessment, of course, is incredibly valuable. We know that if we use it in the family court, we get a lot more information. If we use it for prosecution purposes, we get it. But the question with the danger assessment is, how can we get it before the judge at IA? And how can we get it before the judge in a manner that doesn't disrespect the rights of victims at crime scenes? So if you administer the DA at a crime scene, or you administer any risk assessment tool at the crime scene, the important thing we find is that the survivor needs to be told that the information that she or he sometimes shares is ultimately discoverable. So when you administer that at scene, you connect people with victim advocates, absolutely, that's incredibly valuable. But knowing, the victim knowing that it's discoverable is important. Having a mechanism like we do in Arizona, for example, for the judge to see that information at IA, and that if the prosecutor on the phone here on the webinar wants to check this out, it's ARS 13-3967B5. If you want to check that out, we've got statute in Arizona now, an amendment to the bail statute requires judges to consider those things. So I agree with you, they're very, very useful. Let's see what the next question might be. So why doesn't the perpetrator leave? Exclamation mark. I think the perpetrator doesn't leave because the perpetrator is incredibly vulnerable, dependent, is connected to the world of feeling through that woman. They cannot do intimacy very well. They have very, very strong abandonment anxiety. Goodness knows why. This perhaps traces back to childhood, early abandonment issues. They're extraordinarily sensitive to rejection. So I think that. Another question, would you say that training and consulting is a must for newly formed fatality review teams? I think it's not necessarily a must, but I think it's really, really helpful. We do a lot of TA with communities We now have the ability to do it online. We can do Skype interfacing. We obviously travel to communities a lot. I probably go to 10 to 20 teams a year. So, I think with that we need to end it, being respectful of the time. This will be up and recorded. So we will let you go and see that at your leisure. Thank you for spending some time with me today, and I appreciate you doing that, and thanks for all the terrific work that you do in the field on this important issue. With that, contact information there, and please feel free to call me. My number is up on our website. Our website is ndvfri.org. Thank you.